Hi everybody, it's Lennon and I'm coming to you today in front of my very lovely fire because it's dreary here. And because it's so dreary, this is my reading weather. Okay, you just want to curl up with a good book and get lost, right? And I very much, reading is a huge part of my life. Now, over at Kellyanne Maddox's channel, which I'll leave below, she had a video of books that kissed my soul, okay? Now, she did it really late in her channel life, but I thought, because reading is so important to me, I thought I could use it as a get to know Lennon video, okay? Just a glimpse into what I like to read and what books have kissed my soul. And I loved the concept because it's not just your favorites, right? It's books that are very much imprinted on your soul. And like, if future generations wanted to know Lennon, these are the books I would choose for them to know me, like, based on. So I have a couple of novels, but as we all know, I am a research aficionado, okay? So I have a couple of novels that have imprinted, but then I have resource material that I love, and if anyone wants to know me or does know me, these books will be like, oh yeah, that's definitely Lennon. So let's get started. Okay, I only have two novels actually. The first was my very first book that I read that was transformative. So it is a shape-shifting book, and it's called Blood and Chocolate, okay? And this book, I was like 12, maybe? And there's some romance in here, and then there's a whole, I know that there's a whole shape-shift romance genre out now. But back when I was 12, this was huge. And the romance isn't even in the forefront. It's way, way in the background, okay? Mostly this is a coming-of-age story, which, again, I'm 12, so that's huge for me. And she's a werewolf, so she's a shapeshifter. And this was the first book I ever read that grew my love of transformation and shape-shifting. And of course, the mystery and the magic of that was a huge thing for my 12-year-old self. I was like, there's werewolves, there's myths, actual myths of people that change into animals. Like, now, as we all know from previous videos, I am an outdoors woman. Now, and I'm not talking just like, when you think of outdoorsy, you think mountain climbing and hiking, and while I very much like to do those things, I was more in a sense of being outside spiritually. When I was outside, I was someone and somewhere else. When I was in my giant tree in my childhood yard, it was very much a transformational tree. When I climbed that tree and I was all at the top and nobody else was out there, I was one with nature. And that was a huge part of my childhood and adolescence. And this book was the very first book that really captured how I felt about being outside and being a shapeshifter myself. And so this had a profound impact on me. And if anyone wants to know what's Lennon's favorite novel, or what novel has she read that set her ablaze, or whatever, it would probably be this one. And there are some classics. So that's number one. I actually have three novels. The next is, now this is my very lovely cushy leather copy of the Bronte sister novels, okay? Now this has both Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, but Wuthering Heights is on this list. Not that I don't love Jane Eyre, but Wuthering Heights was the very first romance that I read. And again, I'm young, okay? I'm old enough to know what the feelings are, I guess you could say. And so I'm probably 12 to 15, right? And this was the very first book that wasn't actually romance. It wasn't sickly sweet. Okay, this was a tragedy. They don't get together in the end. Okay, they're not running off into the sunset on his horse. Okay, I mean, if you consider being together in the afterlife a happily ever after, but seriously, I'm very much still an inner child looking for four-leaf clovers in my backyard in the middle of April, okay? But this really was, it was raw and it was real, and it pulled those emotions out of me, okay? So the anger and the bitterness of both the characters, well, more than just them two, but the bitterness and the anger, and how love could transform into those emotions because of the fine line between the two. This was the very first time I ever had this in a book. I mean, I went from fairy tales to this. It's like a big difference because they don't end up together, and you just keep waiting on it to happen, right? You keep saying, oh, you know, she'll fly right into his arms and it's all settled, or he'll just go and get her. And I kept thinking, when is this going to happen? And when it didn't, and when it's like soul hurting. Even thinking about it now, it's like hurts my soul. And it's because you want it so bad, and they want each other so bad, and then it just never happens. And then all the obstacles that they face, this was not a typical romance. And that was the first book that I read that was not a typical romance, where they didn't end up together, like J.R.R. Her and Rochester ended up together at the end. Okay, so that was, even though they did have some obstacles and she was pretty stubborn, right? I still felt like this book called to me on an emotional level, and I really thank this book for that. I'm going to thank all of these books because prints on my soul. I thank them for being in my bookcase. Now, the last novel is The Hobbit, and this kind of goes hand in hand with one of my reference materials, because this book was the very first hero's journey book I ever read. And I'm grateful to that. There's so many hero journey books. I mean, you pick one, okay? But upon reading one of my reference materials, which is also on this list, I knew I could plug in the hero's journey, and it could take me on my own journey. I could plug in my own timeline. But then all of these types of books, these quest books, all are based off the same outline. And I'll tell you which book that is. And it's The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. And when I read this, it opened this. And I remembered this. This was the story that I used when I read this. And like, I think in The Power of Myth, he kind of talks about Star Wars, right? That was the story that he used as an example. But I very much read this with The Hobbit in mind, because this was the very first book that I read that was the hero's journey. And so the hero really does have 1,000 faces. So both of these kind of go hand in hand for me, because I used this as a reference material, but when it comes time to remembering what book was the quest in the hero's journey for me, it was definitely The Hobbit, which I still read today. So, okay, on to the reference material. Now, I have this book. Now, this was very much the first divine feminine book, you could say, that I read. And it took me on so many quests. Unlike The Hobbit, this took me on a quest of the feminine. If you think about it, the hero, mostly they're men. They have these obstacles. They have these triumphant, things that they have to do. And a lot of those stories don't involve the woman being the main character, okay? This does. Now, you cannot read this, Okay, Kellyanne had this on her list too, and I was like, yes, yes, yes. But she includes stories about the feminine and about the wildness of that, and the and how pure the feminine is to the story. And she includes so many. Like I said, you can't read this like a novel. You have to read this like what it is. It's a reference material, okay? So this very much is like you have to read. So you have to read her story, and then you say, and then you put it down, and you're like, oh, okay, I got to think about it. And then you put it down, and you have to really think, I need to think about that section for a second. How do I integrate that to me? Okay, and I very much did that throughout this whole book. I was like, how am I Baba Yaga? Or, how am I Vasilisa? I had to put myself, and I very much do that with all the books, all the novels that I read. I'm capable of putting myself in there, especially with books like this. I am a heroine in here. I am with the dwarves, and I'm headed to Erebor, and I'm drinking the ale and the honey cakes with them, okay? And so I did the same for this. Even though this was a resource material, a reference book for me, I very much did plug myself into it. And I think that was her goal. Find your wild self. Find your wild woman. And I still look at it today, and I still appreciate it for that, and how we'll go more into divine feminine in later videos, but I do appreciate and value this book for having the ability, I believe, for me to map out the feminine, and for me to go in a journey for her that was within me. And so that's why I made this list. Now, the last one before I get into some the books that aren't really books, but they're not even resource materials either. The last book is the Baudelaire. This is called the Fleur de Mal, which means the Flowers of Madness. And this is a collection of poetry by Charles Baudelaire. And poetry has been a huge part of my life because I read lots of poetry, but I write lots of poetry as well. And the poems in here are so emotive that when I purchased the book years ago, it was called The Flowers of Madness. Look at this cover. I thought that this would be about, and I had read some of them already, but I thought that this would probably be like sweet poems, okay? I had no idea that some of the poems in here would be so emotive, so pulling me in to not only the pretty, okay, not only the beautiful, but the scarred and the underbelly of what was his society, like urban decay almost. I could feel all that, and I could feel the prostitutes, and I could feel, his cities, like the grunge. I could feel the grunge, and this was very much the very first poet that I read that had that, okay? That I found out poetry did not have to be safe. It didn't have to be all good. It didn't have to be all beautiful. It didn't have to make sense. It could be all grunge, okay? Like a dark alley in a city street, in a abandoned city block, I could very much tell that from this, and I appreciate this particular edition of his, because it did very much pull that out of me in a way I had no idea existed. I had no idea I could write. First of all, I did write a lot of non-rhyming poetry, just kind of they were like diary entries, and I just kind of jotted the crap down. But I realized, I was like, you know what, today the sun is pissing me off. okay? And I don't want to even think about the sun being the good. Let's write about the sun being bad and how it burns me or how it sears my soul, and I would like to be overcast and raining, or whatever. I could pull what I thought was the good in society. If I didn't think it was good, or if I didn't like that, like my favorite day, like I said, is when it's raining and dreary. That's my favorite day, and I don't like the sun. Much thank this edition for being there for me in a time where not everything was beautiful, and it was okay for it not to be. So, okay, the next two. Now, these are considered resource materials, but they're imprinting on my soul as a researcher, okay? Now, this is called the Synonym Finder. And this is a thick, like thesaurus, edition, okay? I mean, it looks like a dictionary. And it very much kind of is. So any word that you think of Dead Poets Society, and he's like, think of another word besides very. This is what this was to me. And this was actually gifted to me it's beautifully inscribed by a family member. 1996. Ooh. May you always enjoy and cherish the world of words as I have. Keep writing the wonderful poems and stories. It is a gift. And I did. I very much always wrote stories. Well, my head was in the clouds anyway. So I did very much whatever I was seeing out there on the astral, I was writing down in poetry or short stories. And she knew I wanted to sound more intelligent, okay? Because I was always going to her and saying, well, what's another word for blank, and what's another word for this? And so one birthday she gifted this to me, and it was the best gift ever. And that actually applies to my life, okay? Besides razors and socks, right? But this was just a gift within a gift within a gift. And so that very much imprinted on my soul, and it made this list. Now, again, we're talking research here, okay? The researcher in my brain loves signs and symbols. Now, as a lover of the Jungian concept of archetypes and the tarot and finding common themes and symbols within art from different time periods and genres even, I like to look that up. I like to look those things up, and I like to say, okay, well, this has a moon, and then this has a moon. Well, what does the crescent moon mean? And then I flip to that and look it right up, I mean, there's the Sphinx. I mean, this has everything. Numbers, symbols, some dreams even. But this is not even my oldest copy. The other copy I had was from, young. I think it was one of my parents' edition. And it's fallen apart now. So I ended up getting this at the bookstore because I needed to have one in my possession that I could kill again from flipping through it so much. And this is a lifesaver when I am asking myself the base questions. I'm asking myself, what are the common themes between this and this? And when I find them out, I very much use this to dive deep and to dive, if I really like a painting, I'm like, okay, well, what do I like about it? I'm like, well, I like the fact that there's sirens in both. Well, in this book, it would be considered a mermaid. And I look up and I think of, and it tells me all of the stories, and it tells me what they would probably mean when they were drawn back in the ancient times. Like the Anunnaki, okay? They had those fish tails, right? And I live for that. I live to find out the ancient stories. Tell me a story. Still to this day, if I have, especially older family members come over, I want them to tell me a story. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your first car or your first husband, who I have never met. And I want them to tell me a story, but then I think about the common theme. what does her ex-husband and this husband have in common? You know, like, not that I would ever tell her, whoever this mysterious relative is, but that's very much what I like to do. I like to research and dive deep and shovel, as we know from a previous video. So, so that is the last book that I have on this list. And there's so many more. I have hundreds of books in like physical copy, and then I've got even more on my TBR and ebooks, and the list never diminishes, okay? But these very much, and this was kind of hard, you know, the choices that I could have made, but I really went through my physical copies and I was like, do you speak to my soul? Do you speak to my soul? Some of them did not speak. They didn't know what I was talking about, but then others did, and these made the cut. And so I appreciate Kellyanne's video, which I'll leave a link to below, like I said. And I very much hope that this was a let's get to know Lennon video, and I hope it was fun because it was for me. So I hope all y'all have a good day.